hardened rancher with a reputation for cold silence shocks an entire town when he whispers 5 unexpected words. Come here, all of you, to a trembling widow and her shivering children. During the deadliest winter the valley had ever seen, what happened next would become a legend whispered around fires for generation in the winter of 1894, when the winds screamed like hungry spirits across the Wyoming Valley and snow piled so high it swallowed fences whole. The widow Marlowe trudged through the darkness, with her 3 children huddled together like a cluster of frightened sparrows beneath her torn shawl, their breath forming pale ghosts in the air as they tried desperately to outrun the cold that clung to them like a living curse. And though she whispered to them over and over that the storm would break soon, deep inside she feared the truth, that they were only one short mile away from collapsing on that lonely trail. In those days, most folks in Clearwater County kept to themselves, and every family had its own troubles. So when the townsfolk saw her earlier that day begging the grocer for credit, while her children stood outside shivering, no one felt brave enough or compassionate enough to step forward, not because they wished her harm, but because in a land where hardship was a common language, everyone believed they had too little to share. But tucked away on the far side of the valley, behind wind-blasted pines and a stretch of frozen earth, lived a man named Rawley Grant, a weathered rancher with shoulders broad as barn beams and a silence so heavy it made people uneasy, a man who had buried a wife, 2 brothers, and most of his tenderness, choosing instead to spend his life tending cattle, mending fences, and speaking only when it mattered, which was almost never. Rumor claimed Rawley could stare down a wild stallion without blinking, and that he hadn't smiled since 1889, and not a soul in town had ever seen him invite anyone to his ranch except hired hands. So when the widow Marlowe decided, in a moment of trembling desperation, that her only hope was to reach Rawley's ranch for shelter, even though she feared the man almost as much as the storm, she pushed forward through the blizzard, pulling her youngest son by the hand while the older 2 trudged close behind. But the storm grew fiercer, swallowing their footprints as fast as they made them, and when lightning flashed across the snowy darkness, strange for winter yet terrifying, nonetheless she cried out a prayer, not for safety but simply for one more minute of strength. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking Rawley's land, her boots were stiff with ice, her fingertips burning with a cold so sharp it felt like needles, and her youngest child whimpered that his legs hurt. But when she lifted her eyes, she saw a lantern flickering on Rawley's porch, swinging in the wind like a lonely star calling them home, and though every instinct told her she was a burden, she gathered her remaining courage and led her children down the slope, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs, until at last her frozen knuckles rapped against Rawley Grant's wooden door. Inside, Rawley had been sitting by a fire with only the crackle of burning pine for company, his expression unchanged even when the wind howled through the chinks in the walls. But when he heard the faint knocking, thin, weak, desperate, he rose with the heavy reluctance of a man who does not enjoy surprises, and as he opened the door, the blizzard threw white dust into the room, the lantern outside casting pale light across the widow's trembling face. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at her with those steel-gray eyes of his, eyes that had seen too many winters and too much loss. But something inside him shifted when he noticed the children behind her, their shoulders quivering, their lips blue, their hair caked with snow. The widow opened her mouth to speak, to offer some apology for disturbing him or perhaps to collapse, right there on the threshold. But before she could utter a single word, Rawley stepped forward, his voice deep and quiet as he said the 5 words that would become legend long, after their footprints melted from the snow. Come here, all of you. And with those words, the small family moved into the warmth of his home, the children stumbling like newborn calves toward the fire as Rawley shut the door behind them, sealing out the roar of the storm while something warmer than the hearth fire began, for the first time in years, to glow faintly in the depths of his lonely chest. The fire snapped and hissed as the little family huddled close, steam rising from their frozen coats as Rawley Grant moved methodically around the room, tossing on more wood, setting pots of water to heat, draping blankets over shoulders, so cold he feared their skin might crack, like old porcelain. And while he worked with the quiet precision of a man who rarely wasted a gesture, the widow Marlowe watched him with a mixture of awe and bewildered relief, for she had expected dismissal, perhaps even anger, But what she saw instead was a man whose silence carried not hardness but a deep, buried softness that had long forgotten how to reach daylight. In the flickering firelight, Rawley's weathered face looked older than she remembered, lined not merely by wind and labor but by years of sorrow that had carved themselves into every crease. He said little as he prepared hot broth, but when he finally placed the bowls into the children's hands, his voice softened unexpectedly, almost cracking as he murmured, "Slow, don't burn your tongues." And the tiny kindness struck the widow like a blow, for no one had spoken to her. Children with such gentle weight since her husband died 2 winters ago. Outside, the storm battered the ranch with renewed fury, rattling shutters and roaring across the chimney like some furious beast. And in those hours when survival depended solely on the thickness of walls and the strength of embers, the widow found herself speaking quietly of her journey, of how sickness had drained their savings, how work had grown scarce, how she had overstayed the mercy of the townspeople not because they were cruel but because they were afraid to share what little they had. Rawley listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening at certain points, his hands pausing only once when she mentioned the children going hungry the last 2 nights, and something hot flashed briefly across his eyes, not anger at her, but at the injustice of a world that had allowed such hardship to fall on shoulders already broken by grief. As hours passed and midnight bled into morning, the storm finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a valley sculpted in cruel silence. And though the widow rose to gather her children and prepare for departure, Rawley's hand landed gently on her shoulder, firm but calm as he said, "You're not stepping foot into that cold again." And before she could argue, he added, "Not until I say you're strong enough." "Not until they're strong enough?" Then glanced toward her children, now dozing like small animals curled in warmth, and the widow, her throat tightening, nodded because she realized that arguing with a man like Rawley, stubborn, principled, relentless, was as futile as arguing with the mountains surrounding them. The next day, Rawley saddled his horse, wrapped himself in heavy wool and rode into town, where the surprised townsfolk watched him stride into the general store and slam a full month's worth of supply orders onto the counter. Then when the grocer blinked and said it seemed a mighty large load for one man, Rawley replied in a tone that brooked no doubt, "It's for the Marlowe family. They're under my roof now." And with that simple declaration, the town's gossip wheel spun like wildfire, carrying the story to every ear within hours. When Rawley returned to the ranch, he found the children sweeping the kitchen floor, eager to help while their mother stood at the doorway looking equal parts grateful and uncertain. But Rawley simply handed her a sack of flour and said, "You'll stay here through spring, maybe longer. This ranch needs people in it." And though the offer stunned her, the hope in his eyes, hope that frightened him more than any blizzard, told her he meant every word. Over the following weeks, the ranch transformed from a quiet, lonely outpost into a home filled with laughter, chores, and the chaotic energy of children who had finally found safety again.